want to thank the organizers of the program for having me here. And I got to say, Lauren is a hard act to follow. But I think that you'll find that, although this is a very different talk from hers, that it's actually quite compatible, that I'm going to be saying in a different way a lot of the same things that she has said. So where are my controls here? Is that it? Yeah. So there's my disclaimer. I am the author and copyright owner of the SNAP. But I also want to say I require a license but not a fee for non-commercial unfunded research, so just let me know if you'd like to use it. But if you're going to make money off of it, then I do require a fee. Figure fair is fair. So here's an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about personality and how the concept of personality developed from the early 20th century to today, particularly about trait structure. But then I'm going to move to talking about functioning. And I'm going to talk about functioning as a hierarchical construct with some sub-components. First, the research literature, and then our own empirical data, and just a little bit about the clinical literature. And then I'm going to talk about how traits and functioning overlap, again, both empirically and conceptually, and think about future steps in terms of integrating normal and personality disorder range functioning. So let's start with the organization, or the conceptualization of personality in the early 20th century. Allport is often considered the father of personality, and he used the term undivided personality. But he said that personality has two components. Personality is, and personality does. So understanding what a personality entails, understanding a personality entails knowing not only what its traits are, but also what its traits do. How traits are expressed in habitual adjustments to life's major problems. The traits are dynamic and determinative, and they direct our responses into characteristic channels. Well, over the early years of personality research, the is part of personality really took ascendance. It started with Thurstone, who posed 5 independent common factors. 5 sound familiar? Allport and Odbert started with 4,500 trait descriptors and boiled those down, and then Cattell took them and factor analyzed them back in the day when a single factor analysis took about a year because it didn't have computers. And he did the early investigations of personality trait structure in the mid-40s. And Fisk came along, did a meta-analysis, and found that there was a consistent structure even across different raters. And you will recognize this structure as having 5 robust domains, most commonly known by the terms that Costa McCrae popularized: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. In 2005, Marquand, Kruger, and Watson showed that various different models of personality could be brought together and integrated in a consensus hierarchical trait structure. So at the top, they were broad enough that Digman simply called them alpha and beta. They have been given tentative titles of stability and plasticity. At the next level, negative affect or negative emotionality, an externalizing dimension, and a positive emotionality or positive affectivity dimension. Then that externalizing breaks down into agreeableness versus antagonism and constraint versus disinhibition. And then at the very lowest, or the 5-factor level, the positive emotionality, the beta factor, breaks into extroversion, positive emotionality, and openness. So is really dominated. In DSM-5, Section 2, this was also in DSM-4 and earlier versions, the definition of personality disorder started with traits. That a personality disorder is enduring, pervasive, inflexible set of traits. But they are traits that lead to clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So the definition also implied does, that personality does something. There are difficulties, though, with the DSM-5 definition. It's atheoretical. There's no clear way to link the traits with impairment, the is and the does. It's also inconsistent with other areas of medicine in which impairment is considered a consequence of a disorder, not part of its definition. So if you have a sprained ankle, you have a sprained ankle not because you can't walk, but because you have a torn ligament. So impairment is a consequence. So I'm going to leave that there and switch to talking about functioning, and then we'll come back and put them together later. So starting with the research literature, a student of mine and then a postdoc did a review of the literature and looked at what the traditional conceptualizations of functioning were out there in the literature, systematic review of all the measures that were out there, and found that they broadly fell into three different types. Daily functioning, can you manage your finances? Basic functioning, can you stand up from sitting down? Can you take care of your bodily needs? And quality of life or satisfaction. So examples would be the social functioning questionnaire of Peter Tyre, I complete my tasks at work and at home satisfactorily. Basic functioning, probably the HUDAS is the premier measure in the past 30 days. How much difficulty did you have in standing up from sitting down? And the satisfaction with life scale, Ed Diener, in most ways my life is close to my ideal. We found 14 measures that we were able to put together into a questionnaire. 2 daily measures, 5 basic measures, and 7 quality of life satisfaction measures. We factor analyzed those. And we found basically 2 factors. The first factor being a well-being versus poor daily functioning. So psychological well-being scale, satisfaction with life scale, the WHO-QoL, psychological functioning, social relationships, versus the social adjustment scale of Myrna Weissman and the social functioning questionnaire of Tyre. And then the second factor was basic functioning. It's almost all HUDAS, with a few of the WHO-QoL factors that were more about physical kinds of things, environmental barriers and low physical health quality. But these were related to each other. These were not independent factors. They were correlated almost 0.6. So this implied that functioning is a hierarchical construct with 2 lower order factors. So now thinking about functioning in DSM-5 Section 3, the model proposed by the work group, it's come to be known as the alternative DSM-5 model of personality disorder, or just the AMPD, it's usually called, involves the reemergence of does, the does part of personality. Claims that extreme traits alone do not equal a personality disorder, that something about disorder implies dysfunction. So this raises the question, what is dysfunctional in personality disorder? Which then leads to the question, well, what's the function of personality? So for example, the function of lungs is to take in oxygen. So COPD is a disorder because it interferes with lung functioning. That's why we call it a disorder. Or the knee is supposed to enable mobility. So a torn ACL, we call a disorder because it disrupts mobility. So what's the function of personality? Lipsley proposed an evolutionary theory, which I think is compatible with Lorna's view, that personality evolved to handle major life tasks. And the tasks that he proposed were a stable representation of self or other. You got to have an idea of yourself over time to be able to interact with other people over time, and that have some confidence that they are going to be the same thing day after day and you are going to be the same thing day after day. That kind of stability that we need. The personality also developed to help us have a capacity for relationships and for intimacy and for being part of a herd, as Lorna would have put it, for effective societal functioning. And that involved both cooperative relationships, building tall buildings together, and prosocial behavior, helping one another out in a crisis, even if you don't know the individual. So as part of the development of the alternative model, Bender, Mori, and Skotel did a review of the clinical literature and looked at clinician-rated measures of personality pathology and found that the majority of them did focus on these self-other dimensions. So they investigated the feasibility and utility of a functioning severity scale and ended up developing the level of personality functioning scale, which is in the AMPD. And the core of the level of personality functioning scale, the essential dysfunction, is impairments in core personality functioning, both self-functioning, so identity, self-directedness, and interpersonal functioning, empathy, and intimacy. So if you go back to the two-factor hierarchical model of functioning we found, well-being, poor daily functioning, and basic functioning, where does personality functioning fit into this model? Specifically both self and interpersonal functioning. So we found 3 self-report measures of personality functioning: Livesley's General Assessment of Personality Disorder, Rule-Verheuel's Severity Indices of Personality Pathology, and Gordon Parker's Measure of Disordered Personality Functioning. And just to give you an idea of these measures, the self-functioning, Livesley, I have very contradictory feelings about myself. I'm often confused about what kind of person I am. I feel like I'm going around in circles in life. And then the interpersonal measure, I don't have anyone I would call a close friend. I often comment adversely on others' beliefs or actions. I'm generally ready and willing to lend an ear, obviously reverse keyed. So when we factor analyzed the 14 measures I mentioned before and these 3 measures, we replicated the well-being versus poor daily functioning factor. But we found that the self-functioning scales fit right in with the well-being and poor daily and self-functioning. And pretty strong loading, so they clearly fit in with that. And you can see 2 samples here. So the first sample was the one that I showed you before. The second is a complete replication sample, pretty good replicability. The second factor came out interpersonal dysfunction, all by itself. And the third factor was basic functioning. So now we have a 3-factor hierarchical structure of functioning with interpersonal function added to the other 2 and with self-functioning folding in with well-being and poor daily functioning. The correlations there range from about 0.4 to about 0.5. We tested this structure's robustness. One replication wasn't good enough for us. We wanted to do it with a little bit different set of measures to see if it would withstand being able, not just that set of measures, but other similar type measures, and in a new sample of community adults and community mental health patients. We standardized within sample to take out the level differences in order to not just have severity factors. We again got the 3-factor structure of poor daily and self-functioning. You can see the self-functioning measures in there. The interpersonal dysfunction. But interestingly, we found a little bit of overlap there. The GAPD self-dysfunction actually loaded on both the self and the interpersonal. Again, kind of evidence of a hierarchical, that these factors are interrelated with each other. And the PWB actualization, which is not exactly an interpersonal dysfunction measure, loaded on the interpersonal dysfunction scale. And then good versus poor basic functioning. So again, we replicated this 3-factor structure. Correlations previously were about 0.4 to 0.5. Correlations in this new sample, 0.4 to 0.65. Very similar results. So I hope I've established for you that functioning is an overarching construct. And now I want to switch to talking about its relationship with traits, both empirically and conceptually. So the first thing we did, we went back to this earlier sample And we looked at the 3 factors in relation to the big 5. And what we found was neuroticism is related to well-being versus poor daily and self-functioning. So that dealing with that sense of threat threatens well-being. Little bleeding over in the patients into interpersonal dysfunction. Extroversion also, low extroversion strongly related to well-being and poor daily and self-functioning. But agreeableness and conscientiousness, that's where interpersonal dysfunction comes into play. So if you're disagreeable or irresponsible, you have poor interpersonal functioning. A little bit of blending of conscientiousness. This is interesting, both into daily functioning, which makes sense. If you're not conscientious, you're not going to be able to handle your finances very well. And even basic functioning, that if you're not very responsible, maybe you burn the rolls. So your self-care doesn't come up to standards. So I would say that you can blend and not just say it's interpersonal dysfunction, but there's a little bit of that externalizing quality to that middle factor, that interpersonal dysfunction is externalizing in the very broad sense that it's used. So the R-square totals are pretty high. It's accounting for quite a bit of the variance in functioning by the personality traits and vice versa, but not basic functioning. I think that's interesting. It's just the well-being and the externalizing. So personality doesn't have much to do with basic self-care and so forth. So empirically, about 50-60% of the variance is accounted for. Yet another new sample. This one is 600, had 2 subsamples, 300 high-risk community adults who were screened for being high on a personality disorder screen, and 300 community mental health patients, about half female, mid-40s. Big range, our total range was 18 to 84. And the high-risk community, about 38% of them had been in mental health treatment in the past. We required that they not be in treatment when they entered into the study, but we found that about 40% of them had been in treatment in the past. Mostly white. The patients, about a quarter black, smaller percentage in the high-risk community. Interestingly, educational level was the same in the 2 groups. Modal was some post-high school. It included trade school. About a third, only a high school degree, and a little less than a quarter, about a fifth, had some college. Income level varied widely between the 2 groups. The patients were quite poor. The modal income for the high-risk community was 20 to 40, so not one of your sort of standard get the community, college community adults to come and do your research. This is pretty representative. And again, we replicated the 3-factor structure of functioning, well-being versus poor and daily functioning. There you can see those self-functioning measures in there. The interpersonal dysfunction plus scale, I now call it there. You see the GAPD bleeding over again, and actualization going there again. So this is quite a robust set of measures. And the good versus poor basic functioning. So there was the previous intercorrelations of these 3 factors. And, that actually is the current one, 0.3 to 0.6. Before it was 3 to 4, 3 to 6.5, always in roughly the same range. So again, we've replicated that these overlap about 50 to 60%. So I'm going to talk entirely about traits for a minute, go back to the is portion of personality. In this same IMP sample, we administered the SNAP, my measure, 15 scales that divided broadly into 3 higher order domains: negative affectivity, positive affectivity, and essentially externalizing. The DAP, a couple of scales from the DAP that were not well covered by the SNAP, so I wanted to be sure to include those: insecure attachment and intimacy problem. All the other DAP scales correlated highly with SNAP ones, so they would have been redundant. Press the wrong button. There we go. And the PID-5. with its 5 higher order domains: negative affectivity, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, and psychoticism, 25 scales all told. So you're familiar with the hierarchical trait model, I imagine. I showed it earlier. This was replicated in the PID-5, at least conceptually. Those are the PID-5 negative affectivity facets. Those are the antagonism facets, and hostility is shown down at the bottom because it always cross-loads between those two. There's a disinhibition factor, irresponsibility, impulsivity, a detachment factor, withdrawal, intimacy avoidance, so forth, and a small psychoticism factor with three facets. So when we factor analyzed all of these scales together, we got a very robust negative affectivity scale: anxiety, negative temperament, separation insecurity, emotional ability, depressivity. We got a strong antagonism factor: PID-5 callousness, deceitfulness, snap manipulativeness. Press the right one. Yeah. What we found was that a few agreeableness measures went on the opposite end. So it is a bipolar factor. So we got altruism and sympathy. I forgot to mention those scales. Sorry about that. There were big 5 scales that, again, were not well represented in any of the other measures. So we added them to make sure that there was good representation of all 30 facets of the NEO. And we also got the SNAP externalizing or disinhibition scale and PID-5 irresponsibility. So there was a little bit of that disinhibition coming in on this, and I would like to suggest it's really an externalizing versus agreeableness factor. A next factor was detachment, withdrawal, intimacy problems, anhedonia, intimacy avoidance. And it had some extroversion facets on the opposite end, so SNAP positive temperament loaded the opposite end. And interestingly, a few kind of what I'm calling externalizing extroversion, exhibitionism, attention-seeking, also loaded on the low end of that scale. And I think the most interesting two are SNAP entitlement and IPIP altruism, because they cross-loaded between the externalizing versus agreeableness factor and the detached externalizing extroversion factor. And what's really interesting is they're both low, i.e. externalizing extroversion, but they split. They go in opposite directions when it comes to externalizing versus agreeableness. So entitlement is disagreeable and altruism is an agreeableness facet. Then we got a psychoticism factor. And interestingly, it shaded, it wasn't just sort of pure psychoticism, but it picked up that schizotypal flavor because suspiciousness and mistrust loaded on this. And somewhat to our surprise, also PID-5 impulsivity. So it's kind of an unstable schizotypy factor. And also to our surprise, but I think happily, we found kind of an anancastic factor. And I'll talk a little bit about the ICD in just a second. That's a factor that's in the ICD structure. So propriety, workaholism, rigid perfectionism, order. And on the opposite end, some externalizing variables. So impulsivity loaded on the opposite end of this anancastic factor. This was something that the DSM-5 work group tried to find and was unable to do so. But we were able to get it in this data set. So there's the DSM-5 Section 3 hierarchical model. And here's the ICD hierarchical trait model. So it's got negative affectivity, dissocial, detachment, disinhibition. Those are all the same. It doesn't have psychoticism, but it has an anancastia factor. Now, it doesn't have psychoticism because schizotypal disorder is in the schizophrenia section in ICD, not in the personality disorder section. And dissocial is just another name. It really is the equivalent factor to DSM-5 antagonism. So if we just mush these two together, both have negative affectivity, and there's a dissocial antagonism factor. They both have detachment. They both have disinhibition. DSM has psychoticism, and ICD has anancastia. How does that relate to the structure that we found? In our integrated hierarchical model, disinhibition did not emerge as a separate factor on its own. It split up. Half of it went with the dissocial antagonism on the positive side, so all positive loadings, and the other half of it formed the opposite end of anancastia. The other factors emerged: negative affectivity, detachment, and psychoticism. So we really got negative affectivity, an externalizing factor, which has both antagonism and disinhibition, detachment, psychoticism, and anancastia versus disinhibition. And as I showed you, it was kind of an unstable, schizotypal psychoticism. And the externalizing was versus agreeableness, and the detachment was versus that externalizing extroversion. And I think we're getting a little bit different factor from normal range because there's just so much pathology in this sample and in these measures. So we get a little bit different flavor from just the straight Big Five. If you do a whole, what Goldberg called a bass-ackwards analysis, and you start with the top, alpha and beta are kind of placeholders. What happens first is that beta breaks up and alpha break up, and you end up with what's pretty familiar three-factor model, very similar to Eysenck's negative affectivity or neuroticism, an externalizing factor and a detachment factor or low extroversion. At the next level, what happens is detachment breaks up into anancastia and detachment versus this externalizing extroversion. And at the fifth factor, then the negative affectivity psychoticism factor breaks up. So you get the negative affectivity, psychoticism, externalizing, anancastic versus disinhibition, and detachment versus externalizing extroversion. Remember the three-factor structure of functioning? Well, what happens if you try to put together a trait and functioning model? Because we know that traits and functioning overlap about 50 to 60%. So if you factor everything together, you get a negative affectivity and self-pathology factor. We saw that before in the correlations. Now we're getting it in the factor analysis. With quality of life at the other end. So well-being, self-pathology, negative affectivity. As I said, we saw this in the correlations. We're now confirming it. Different sample in the factor analysis. Second factor is clearly internalizing, or the overarching title for this, rather than this complicated negative affect plus self-pathology versus quality of life, you can just say it's an internalizing factor of traits and functioning. The next factor is the dissocial antagonism factor. And what do you bet goes here in terms of functioning? Come on, class. Interpersonal. Of course, we get the interpersonal disagreeableness or agreeableness first on the opposite end, and then a few more traits coming in there, the disinhibition, psychoticism, and we really have an externalizing factor here. And finally, interpersonal dysfunction. So we have an externalizing plus interpersonal dysfunction. Let's just put those together in one label, externalizing interpersonal dysfunction. So we have internalizing, self-function, externalizing interpersonal dysfunction. Third factor is detachment. Opposite end of that is agreeableness. We also get some interpersonal dysfunction here. So what's going on? Interpersonal dysfunction has now split into an externalizing interpersonal dysfunction and more of an internalizing or detached interpersonal dysfunction. Then we get poor basic daily functioning with the quality of life, the opposite end. And I was surprised to find a number of traits that just split all across the board. So there's some traits that are so dysfunctional, they just relate to everything. Self-harm, to internalizing and general dysfunction. Eccentric perceptions, to externalizing interpersonal, to general, and this fifth factor we're going to see in a minute. Mistrust and suspiciousness load on every single dimension. Very general maladaptive traits to be suspicious and mistrustful. So this is just a very broad functioning and trait general dysfunction factor. And finally, our fifth factor, anancastia, with some definitely antagonistic traits and a little tiny bit of functioning. So basic functioning is, again, independent for the most part. And here's the joint hierarchical structure of personality traits and functioning. It starts at the top with internalizing versus well-being and good functioning, and externalizing. Then externalizing breaks into two dimensions, externalizing and detachment, each of which has interpersonal functioning involved. Then anancastia breaks off. And finally, at the very, do I have a pointer here? Yeah, at the very end, the basic functioning breaks off. I expected it to break earlier, but actually, traits and functioning remain involved with each other all through here until finally the basic functioning breaks off at the very end. So, what is our next step in understanding personality disorder? What are we missing? What I think we need is a theoretical basis for personality functioning. We need to integrate our understanding of personality functioning across the normal-abnormal spectrum. I've been talking only about measures of personality dysfunction. But are there theories of personality functioning out there in the normal range personality literature with which we can integrate this way of thinking that worked very well for traits? Sure, there's some differences between normal range personality and pathological personality, but you can really see that there's a huge degree of overlap. You can integrate those two different domains. Can we do the same for personality functioning? So I was looking in the literature, and Dan McAdams has what he calls his three-layer theory of personality. The first layer is traits, what personality is. The second layer is people's goals and values, their motivations, what personality does. And the third level is the life narrative. How do you make sense of your life as a whole? How do you put it all together? So, personality is. Where do we move from here in terms of that? I think we need simply to continue to educate ourselves and the field about this aspect of personality and personality, abnormal personality, normal range and abnormal personality, and begin to think more and more about abnormal personality in terms of its component traits. The life narrative, I believe, is probably most relevant in treatment. And thinking about, there are narrative therapies, for example, that help people to re-story their lives, to position their parents and their spouses and their children's in a new narrative that is more helpful, more healthy. It's the goals and values that is, I think, the level at which we can integrate across the abnormal normal personality divide in terms of functioning. This is where personality does. So we kept looking in the literature, and it turns out that there are two fundamental motivations that many, many theorists have talked about, and they have associated goals and values. They've been called communion and agency, getting along and getting ahead, affection and ambition, cooperation, competition, affiliation and dominance, need for belongingness and acceptance versus need for status, to love and to work, Lieben und Arbeiten, which I'm sure I massacred. So what if we think of these as two major ways in which interpersonal relationships can go wrong? Go back to two major factors of interpersonal problems. When ambition goes awry, when competition goes awry, when dominance goes awry, when affection goes awry, when cooperation, affiliation go bad, either because they are overdone or underdone. If we reconceptualize externalizing and detachment in terms of normal range personality, we get all of those terms, dominance and affiliation. So my hypothesis is that the traits of dissociality, antagonism, disinhibition, and detachment confer a specific liability to develop a maladaptive strategy of pursuing agency, getting ahead, ambition, competition, dominant status, and communion, getting along, affection, cooperation, affiliation, belonging, acceptance. So this allows us to integrate across the normal and abnormal divide in terms of personality functioning as well as traits. So McAdams' three-layer theory for personality, I think we can make into an integrated three-layer theory for personality and personality disorder. We have the traits, establish theory and measures. We just need to refine them, educate ourselves and those who follow us about the role of traits in personality and personality pathology, motivations, goals, and values. We now have, as I discovered in researching this, an established theory that we can integrate with personality disorder theory. There's some work that needs to be done there. And we need to develop more measures for the pathological range and measures that will cross from the normal, abnormal, the way we have with the personality traits. And then life narrative, as I said, I think is there mostly to further treatment development, to think along the lines of the big picture of one's life. But what about self-pathology? That was all about interpersonal pathology. It seems to be based in fundamental temperament, most intertwined with negative affectivity. And it develops very early in conjunction with very basic learning in childhood and adolescence. Emotional and behavior self-regulation, self-other differentiation. There's a lot of work yet to be done. Those are all the people who helped me on this project, and I want to thank NIMH for the money and the NASPD program organizers for inviting me to speak with you, and to thank you for all listening and attending. So I think we have a little time for questions, 5 minutes for questions.
This is a psychiatrist question to a psychologist, okay? To what extent do we need to tolerate overlaps between dimensions, like you gave the most example of hostility, negative affect, and antagonism? Because it seems like it's going to be part of your life.
It is.
What do you think about that? What
Yep.
extent should we tolerate it or not? Or do you need to be an ideal psychologist who have very clear dimensions?
No, we call them interstitial traits, and there are lots of them. Yeah. So we try to find the pure ones so we know what the core of the factor is, but reality is that there are many interstitial traits. So I complicate my talks a little bit by throwing those in because I want to remind us that life isn't pure. So that's a very good question. So it shouldn't bother us, but the clean factors help us know what the core is. And then there's a penumbra around those. Rebecca.
So, in the way that you were presenting the relationship between traits and goals at the end, it almost seems like you're seeing them as part of the same system
I wouldn't put it in terms of reducing, but I think our traits channel them. That's what the 50%, 60% overlap is. I mean, those R squares are high. So I think we can conceptually separate them, but I think empirically they're overlapping, and we need to sort of figure that out. Yeah, I don't have an answer, but that's why I said that's my hypothesis, is that the traits channel.
Well, it could be that you can conceptualize goals at two different levels. So the way that you're talking about them are these very sort of broad,
Yes.
kind of motivational
Yes.
channels, as opposed to just the things that you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's, as you say, broad motivations versus specific strategies for enacting.
You're trying to do day-to-day as opposed
Right.
to,
Right. But it might be helpful to have that framework to think about your day-to-day goals.